I never trusted the silence of that house. Even on the brightest afternoons, when the sun washed the walls in a golden haze, there was a weight to the air that clung to the skin like damp cloth. The house was old, far older than the polished wood floors and freshly painted trim suggested. Beneath the neat renovations, I could feel the bones of something forgotten, something that waited for me long before I signed the lease. I noticed the door on my third night. It was a soft discovery, almost accidental. I had been unpacking late, moving between the kitchen and the narrow hallway that connected the living room to the back of the house. The stairs stood there, boxed in by faded wallpaper, a modest rise of 12 steps leading to the second floor. From the first day, I'd thought I understood their shape. Just a typical staircase, nothing remarkable. But as I passed with an armful of plates, a sliver of shadow at the base of the steps caught my eye. It wasn't a shadow, not really. It was a seam, a thin, vertical line where the paneling broke the smooth pattern of the wall. The more I stared, the more wrong it felt. There shouldn't have been anything there. The floor plan I'd studied before moving in showed no closet, no storage, just a solid wall beneath the staircase. Yet there it was, an outline of a door hiding behind the same dull wallpaper, its edges barely visible until I ran my fingertips across them and felt the faint ridge beneath the paper. The wallpaper crumbled slightly under my touch. It left a faint dust on my skin, dry and bitter like old plaster. I pressed harder, expecting a hollow echo, but the wall answered with a dense, muffled thud. There was wood behind it, a doorframe. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The discovery lived in the corners of my mind, scratching softly like a small animal behind the walls. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, creaks that stretched like sighs through the floorboards, tiny ticks as the pipes cooled, and each sound felt sharper, more deliberate. It was as if the house wanted me to remember that hidden door. By morning, the urge to peel back the wallpaper had settled into my bones. I told myself it was harmless curiosity, nothing more. I fetched a utility knife from the box in the kitchen and knelt at the base of the stairs. The first cut released a smell that startled me, a sour, metallic odor, faint but unmistakable. Old air, stale and heavy, like the inside of a long-sealed trunk. The wallpaper tore away in strips, revealing dark wood beneath. A door, small, narrow, and unmistakably old. The wood was darker than the surrounding trim, almost black with age. The handle was a dull brass knob streaked with tarnish, locked tight. There was no keyhole, only a small circular plate where one should have been. I pressed my ear to the wood, half expecting the hush of dead air, but instead I heard something else. A faint hum. It wasn't mechanical, not the buzz of electricity or the drone of distant pipes. It was softer, almost organic, a low vibration that seemed to come from deep inside the wood itself. The sound pulsed against my skin when I touched the surface, like a heartbeat buried beneath layers of oak. I tried the knob again. It refused to turn. My nails scraped against the brass, catching on tiny imperfections. The air near the door felt different, too, cooler, damper, as though the space behind it held a climate of its own. The smell had strengthened, carrying a note of earth and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. That night, I dreamed of the door. In the dream, the stairs stretched higher than the ceiling, vanishing into a black void. The door beneath them was wider, breathing faintly with each exhale of the house. I stood before it, hand on the knob, and felt the steady thump of something alive pressing against the other side. I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth, and the echo of that hum lingering in my ears. Days passed, but I couldn't stay away. Each evening, after work, I found myself kneeling before the locked door, fingertips tracing the grain of the wood, searching for weaknesses. I tried tools, screwdrivers, crowbars, but the frame refused to yield. The wood wasn't just old, it was wrong. My crowbar slid against it, as if the grain repelled metal. The house changed with my obsession. The air grew colder, dampness creeping into the corners of rooms that had once felt warm. Floorboards groaned even when I stood still, and sometimes the hum behind the door deepened into a rhythm too deliberate to dismiss. It matched my heartbeat at times, only to shift suddenly, a reminder that something on the other side was listening. One night, as rain hammered the roof and wind rattled the windows, I pressed my ear against the door and heard it. A soft scrape, not a random creak or the shifting of wood. It was the sound of something dragging slowly across a floor. The movement was deliberate, slow enough that I could imagine each inch of whatever waited beyond. My breath fogged the wood, and for a brief, insane moment, I thought I felt breath push back from the other side. I couldn't sleep after that. The hum followed me through the house, threading itself through the sigh of vents and the whisper of curtains. Sometimes I caught a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, a dark shape slipping between shadows, always near the staircase. At night, when the house was at its quietest, I swore I heard faint knocks. Not loud enough to be a plea for release. Just small, testing taps, like fingers brushing against wood to remind me it was there. The final night came with no warning. I woke to the sound of the knob turning. Not violently, not the rattle of a forced entry. It turned with a slow, careful precision, the brass squealing faintly as it twisted. I froze in bed, every muscle locked. The house held its breath with me. Then a soft click. The door was no longer locked. I moved without thought, drawn down the hallway, as if the air itself tugged me forward. The staircase loomed, bathed in a faint, sour glow leaking from the cracks around the door. The smell was stronger now, wet soil, rust, and something sweetly rancid. I reached for the knob. It was warm. The hum had grown louder, no longer a vibration, but a sound that filled the marrow of my bones. My hand trembled as I turned the knob. The latch clicked free with a sound far too loud for such a small mechanism. The door swung inward. Blackness pooled beyond it, a darkness thicker than night. The smell of earth and decay surged outward, wrapping around me like a damp blanket. My flashlight barely pierced the void. The stairs inside led down, not to a small crawl space as I had imagined, but into a narrow tunnel carved from raw soil and stone. The walls dripped with moisture, glistening like wet flesh. The hum became a whisper. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it carried intention, an invitation disguised as sound. My foot crossed the threshold before my mind caught up. The soil beneath me was soft, sinking slightly with each step, releasing a cold dampness that seeped through my socks. The door closed behind me. Not a slam, just a slow, deliberate swing until the latch clicked softly into place. The whisper deepened into a low chorus, vibrating through the soil, through my chest, through the hollow spaces inside my skull. I don't remember how far I descended. The tunnel stretched on, bending slightly, always downward. The air thickened, tasting of copper and wet stone. Sometimes I thought I heard movement ahead, shuffling, the soft drag of something heavy, but the darkness never broke. And then suddenly there was nothing. No tunnel, no hum, no smell, only a vast emptiness pressing in from all directions. The ground beneath me vanished, and I felt myself suspended in a darkness so complete it erased the memory of light. I don't remember climbing back. I woke at the base of the stairs in my hallway. The locked door closed behind me. It seemed once again hidden beneath unbroken wallpaper. My flashlight lay beside me, dead and cold. My clothes were damp with soil, and beneath the sharp scent of plaster and wood, that same sweet rot clung stubbornly to my skin. I tried to tear the wallpaper again. It wouldn't budge. The wall was smooth and solid, as if no door had ever existed. But at night, when the house goes still and the air grows heavy, I swear I can hear it, the faint hum beneath the stairs. It hasn't stopped. It's only waiting. I never liked basements. Even before I bought this house, the thought of a room buried under the earth made my skin crawl. The smell of damp concrete, the way sound travels in a hollow space, the knowledge of all that weight pressing down from above. It all feels wrong, like the earth itself is waiting to swallow you. Yet here I am, living above one. I told myself it was just a practical feature, a place to store boxes and old furniture, a space I would barely think about once I moved in. I was wrong. The first week passed without incident. The house was quiet except for the usual creaks of settling wood and the occasional groan of pipes shifting with temperature changes. I tried to ignore the way the basement door sat flush against the kitchen wall like a dark secret, its handle always a little cooler than the rest of the room. I kept it locked, not because I was afraid of anyone breaking in, but because I wanted a barrier, something between me and the stale darkness below. It started on the 8th night. I woke to a sound I could not place. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, some leftover fragment clinging to me as I surfaced from sleep. But then it came again, a single measured footstep. The sound was faint but sharp enough to cut through the stillness of 3 a.m., a deliberate heel-to-toe press of weight against a hard surface. My bedroom sits directly above the basement, and the noise came from beneath me, exactly where the concrete floor should have been empty. I froze, listening. Another step followed, then another, each one slow and patient. There was no rhythm of hurried movement, no scuffle of an intruder searching for valuables. It was the sound of someone pacing, as if testing each square of the basement floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat so loud it felt like it would give me away. I told myself it was the house settling, a pipe knocking, anything but what it sounded like. After several minutes, the footsteps stopped. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Old houses make noises, I reasoned. Perhaps I had imagined it in a half-dreaming state. But that night, and every night after, the sound returned, always at 3 a.m., always the same slow, deliberate pattern. The footsteps would start at one end of the basement, travel the length of the room, pause, and then return. Back and forth. Back and forth. I began to dread nightfall. The hours leading up to 3 a.m. became unbearable stretches of tension. I would lie in bed, eyes wide in the dark, ears straining for the first faint scrape of a shoe against concrete. The sound never came early, never late. It arrived with a precision that made me think of clocks and rituals, of something that kept perfect time beneath my feet. During the day, I tried to investigate. I unlocked the basement door and forced myself down the narrow wooden stairs. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the scent of earth and old stone. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but bare concrete walls and a floor scattered with a few boxes I hadn't unpacked. The silence down there was complete. No dripping pipes, no hidden animals, no signs of entry. I tapped the walls, tested the windows, checked the locks. Everything was secure. Yet every night the footsteps returned. Sleep became impossible. My nerves frayed like old rope. I started noticing other details. A faint metallic taste in the air when the footsteps began, a low vibration through the floorboards, as if something deep in the ground was shifting. Sometimes I thought I smelled damp soil, the sharp tang of rust, or something sweeter and more rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. The sounds were changing too. What began as simple footsteps grew more complex. Some nights I heard a dragging noise between steps, like fabric or fingertips brushing across concrete. Other times there was a faint tapping, almost like nails gently touching the floor. I tried everything to block it out. Earplugs, white noise machines, music played through headphones, all useless. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt. The vibrations seeped into the frame of the house, into the mattress, into my bones. At 3 a.m., the world narrowed to those patient footsteps and the cold certainty that I was not alone. One night, desperation pushed me to stay awake downstairs. I sat in the kitchen with every light on, the basement door a dark rectangle in my peripheral vision. The clock crept toward 3 a.m., each minute stretching thin. When the hour struck, the footsteps began immediately, as if they had been waiting for me. The sound was clearer than ever, weight pressing into concrete, heel first, then toe, a faint echo rising up the stairwell. I gripped the table until my knuckles whitened. The air grew colder, carrying that sickly sweet odor again, a smell like damp soil mixed with something metallic. Then, for the first time, the footsteps changed direction. Instead of pacing back and forth, they moved toward the base of the stairs. Each step landed with measured precision, closer and closer, until I could almost feel the presence standing just behind the door. The handle remained still, but the air around it seemed to shiver, a subtle trembling that set the fine hairs on my arms upright. I waited for the sound of the door turning, for the final step onto the wooden stairs, but it never came. After a long, agonizing pause, the footsteps retreated, fading back into the depths of the basement. I stayed frozen until dawn bled gray across the kitchen windows. When I finally found the courage to check the door, the lock was intact, the air beyond still and heavy. But something was different. A faint outline of dampness traced the bottom step, a dark print shaped like a bare foot. toes splayed as if pressing into the concrete. It was gone by afternoon, evaporated like it had never existed. Days blurred into nights. I stopped trying to sleep and moved through the house in a haze of exhaustion. I considered leaving, but the thought of abandoning the house only fed a deeper fear, that whatever paced below might follow me. Some part of me felt bound to it, as if the footsteps had marked me, claimed me. Then came the night of the silence. I sat awake in bed, waiting for the familiar sounds, but 3 a.m. passed without a single step. At first, I felt relief. Maybe it had ended. Maybe whatever haunted those walls had finally gone. But as the minutes dragged on, relief turned to dread. The silence was not empty. It was loaded, like the pause before a storm. The air felt heavier than ever, the smell of earth and rust stronger, almost suffocating. That was when I heard the creak of a floorboard above me. The sound came from the hallway outside my bedroom. Slow, deliberate, a weight pressing into wood, not concrete. The pacing had moved. The basement no longer contained it. I lay motionless, eyes fixed on the door, heart slamming against my ribs. Another creak followed, closer this time. The footsteps were no longer below. They were inside the house, climbing upward, step by patient step. And somewhere beneath the floor, far below the reach of light, the earth exhaled a breath that smelled of cold stone and something ancient, as if the basement itself had finally opened its eyes. I first noticed the sound in the dead hours of an autumn night, a faint tremor that seemed to hover just above silence. It was like a low, patient hum, steady, almost soothing if it hadn't been so impossibly out of place. The house had been mine for only a few weeks, an inheritance from an uncle I barely remembered, a man whose name lingered like a faint aftertaste of something sour. The property sat on the outskirts of a dying town where the roads were cracked and weeds grew through what remained of the sidewalks. The house itself was a square of fading white paint and warped shutters, leaning slightly against the weight of decades. The basement had always carried a damp smell, the kind of earthy rot that clung to old stone and forgotten corners. I avoided it at first. The narrow wooden stairs bent inward under each step, and the air down there tasted heavy with moisture, thick enough to feel against my teeth. But the hum was impossible to ignore. It pulsed through the floorboards like the faint vibration of an insect's wings, steady and cold. It seemed to come from beneath everything, as though the house itself had a heartbeat. When I finally descended, a thin bulb swung overhead, shedding a weak, yellow light that barely reached the floor. Dust swirled in the air like tiny, frantic moths. The walls were rough stone, slick with condensation. Against the far corner sat a large, antique freezer, an off-white relic with rusted edges and a handle like a piece of bent iron. Its enamel surface was mottled with years of neglect, and the floor beneath it was stained a deep brown, as if something once leaked and dried again and again. It was humming. That sound should not have existed. I traced the power cord along the wall, a brittle black snake that led nowhere. The plug hung loose, its prongs dull and corroded, inches away from an outlet that had been sealed with layers of dust. Yet the freezer vibrated gently under my hand when I touched it, the metal faintly warm despite the chill in the air. The hum deepened for a moment, almost as if it acknowledged me. I left the basement quickly that night, telling myself that old appliances sometimes held heat, that maybe some internal mechanism could hold a charge long after being disconnected. But the explanation felt thin, like paper stretched over something sharp. Even upstairs, the sound followed me. It was subtle but constant, like the resonance of a distant engine through the bones of the house. Days passed. Each night the hum grew clearer, sharpening into a tone that settled behind my eyes. It didn't matter where I stood, bedroom, kitchen, even outside on the sagging porch. It was there, a low, vibrating note that seeped into my teeth and made sleep feel shallow and brittle. I tried to convince myself that it was plumbing, or the ancient furnace exhaling through rusted vents. Yet the source was always the same, the freezer. I began to notice other changes. The basement smelled stronger, a metallic tang that rode the damp air. The floorboards above felt colder, as though the chill rose from below. At times, when the house was quiet enough to hear my own heartbeat, I sensed a faint rhythm buried in the hum, a slow, deliberate pattern like breathing. I would wake in the early hours to find the bulb in the basement flickering even though I had left the switch off, a dull glow seeping through the gaps around the door. Curiosity is a cruel thing. One night, after hours of listening to that endless vibration, I went back down with a flashlight. The air struck me first, sharp, like frozen metal. The walls wept with condensation, droplets sliding down like beads of mercury. The freezer stood exactly as before, but something about it felt changed. The lid looked heavier, the handle slick with moisture, though my breath fogged only faintly in the air. I pressed my ear to the surface. The hum wasn't just sound. It was motion, a deep internal quiver that resonated in my bones. For a brief, sick moment, it felt like standing against the chest of something alive. My fingertips brushed the lid. The metal was slick and faintly warm, pulsing with a heat that had no business existing. The smell grew stronger when I lifted the lid. A cold fog rose out like breath from a hidden mouth. The interior was empty. No shelves, no lining, just a hollow cavity of dull, sweating metal. Yet the temperature inside wasn't freezing. It was lukewarm, damp, like the breath of an animal. The hum swelled, filling the room until it vibrated in my teeth. My flashlight trembled in my grip, and for a second I swore the walls of the freezer flexed inward, as if something pressed from the other side. I slammed the lid shut and stumbled back. The hum dropped to a whisper, but never stopped. I left the basement and wedged the door shut with a chair. Sleep never came that night. The sound crept through the walls like water through cloth, steady and patient. Over the next week, the house itself began to change. Wood warped in slow groans during the night. Shadows stretched against corners where no light should reach. The air upstairs tasted metallic, as if I had bitten my tongue. I avoided the basement entirely, but the hum grew louder, blooming through the walls until it seemed to originate from inside my own skull. My dreams, when I managed to drift off, were filled with images of slick metal and slow, rhythmic breathing. One evening, after a storm had smeared the sky into a bruise-colored dusk, I noticed condensation creeping up the stairwell wall outside the basement door. Dark streaks of moisture pooled at the edges, and the wood beneath my feet vibrated with a subtle tremor. The chair I had wedged against the door was damp, the paint blistering where it touched the wood. That night, I woke to the unmistakable sound of the freezer lid opening. It was not a sharp creak or sudden crash, but a long, deliberate lift, metal scraping against metal. My body froze beneath the blankets, heart hammering in a rhythm that almost matched the hum. A soft exhalation followed, like air escaping a deep cavern. Then silence. I do not remember making the decision to move. One moment I was in bed, the next I was standing in the hallway, the house trembling around me. The basement door stood open, a black mouth yawning into deeper darkness. The bulb below flickered with a weak, unnatural light, pulsing in time with the hum. I descended despite every screaming instinct. The air grew colder with each step, a clammy chill that soaked into my skin. At the bottom, the freezer stood with its lid wide open. The cavity inside was no longer empty. A dark, wet sheen coated the metal, reflecting the light like a pool of oil. The hum had become a low, resonant growl that pressed against my chest. I leaned closer without meaning to. The surface inside rippled, subtle but unmistakable, as though something beneath was shifting in slow, deliberate motion. A warmth radiated upward, damp, organic, like breath from deep earth. The smell was overwhelming now, a blend of iron and old water, and something faintly sweet, like decaying fruit. Then came the sound. Not the hum, not the growl, something else. A wet, dragging movement from within the freezer's hollow depth, followed by a faint, rhythmic thud, as if something inside was slowly trying to climb upward. I stumbled back, knocking over the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows against the sweating stone. The freezer lid began to close, not in a sudden slam, but with a slow, deliberate motion, as if guided by unseen hands. The hum deepened into a single, bone-rattling note that made the light flicker and my vision blur. When the lid finally settled shut, the sound softened, returning to its patient, steady vibration. I don't remember leaving the basement. I only remember standing in the yard hours later, the night air sharp and wet against my face. Behind me, the house loomed dark and silent. Yet even from the tree line, far from the door, I could still hear it. The faint, persistent hum of the old freezer, alive in the earth, waiting. I never went back inside. The house remains empty now, windows broken by weather and time, but sometimes, on certain nights when the wind dies and the world holds its breath, neighbors swear they can hear a low, patient vibration seeping from the ground, like the heart of something that refuses to die. And I know it's still there. The old freezer, unplugged for decades, humming to itself in the dark. The house had always carried a low, humming presence, a constant undercurrent of sound that never fully belonged to any single source. It wasn't the fridge, though the kitchen was a web of faint mechanical sighs. It wasn't the pipes either, even though the walls sometimes gave a hollow shudder when the temperature dropped. No, this sound lived beneath everything else, a low and steady murmur that seemed to vibrate through the bones of the building itself. The furnace room sat at the far end of the basement, behind a heavy wooden door that swelled with humidity and age. I'd walked past it countless times, its chipped paint catching the dull glow of the single bare bulb that lit the basement's concrete corridor. The air around it was always warmer, carrying a dry, metallic scent that clung to the back of the throat. But it wasn't until the dead of winter, when the days shortened into endless gray evenings, that I began to notice something else. Something alive inside the hum. It started with my name. Soft, almost imperceptible, a drawn-out exhalation that rode the furnace's steady drone. The first time I heard it, I was carrying a box of old clothes down the stairs. My foot paused mid-step, the cardboard creaking in my arms. I told myself it was the pipes settling, a draft squeezing through the foundation. Yet the sound had shape, a distinct rise and fall, curling at the edges like a breath drawn too close to the ear. I set the box down and listened. The furnace door remained shut. The bulb above flickered in a slow, unsteady rhythm. Dust motes spun lazily in the faint cone of light. The air smelled faintly of rust and damp concrete. I stood there longer than I should have, heart beating hard enough to feel it in my fingertips, until the sound finally folded back into silence. From then on, the whispers became a pattern. Always at night, always when I was alone. They never called loudly. Instead, they seeped into the spaces between things, the hum of the furnace, the faint static of old wiring. Sometimes it came as a low hiss, stretching my name until it became a soundless shape. Other times it clicked against the rhythm of the machinery, like the gentle scrape of fingernails along the inner walls of a vent. I began to dread the basement. The steps felt longer each time, each creak a warning swallowed by the dark. I'd hold my breath when passing the furnace room door, a thin strip of light bleeding out from beneath as if something inside was waiting. But the house demanded trips downward. The circuit breakers, the storage shelves, the washing machine, all excuses to descend into that thick, humming air. The furnace room itself was nothing special. A narrow space with exposed pipes running like veins across the ceiling. A single rusting unit crouched in the center like a sleeping animal. The concrete floor bore old stains, blackened rings where water once pooled, faint trails of rust bleeding from the joints. A workbench sat along the far wall, littered with tools dulled by years of neglect. And yet the moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature shifted. Warmer, yes, but heavy in a way that felt wrong, like breathing through damp cloth. The whispering never came when the door was open. Only when I stood in the hall, separated by that swollen wooden barrier, did the voice find shape. My name stretched thin. Sometimes it repeated, sometimes it simply lingered on the edge of hearing, as if waiting for me to answer. Days bled into weeks. Sleep became a shallow, restless thing. I'd wake to the faint vibration of the house, the distant murmur threading through the floorboards. At first I thought it was the furnace cycling on, but even when the system was silent, the sound persisted, a low, crawling resonance that seemed to pulse with my heartbeat. One night, unable to stand it any longer, I decided to stay in the basement. I told myself it was to prove nothing was there, to finally break the hold that narrow room had over me. I brought a chair to the foot of the stairs and sat in the dark, the bulb above the furnace door casting its dull circle across the floor. The smell of warm metal and damp stone filled the air. Minutes stretched into an hour. The hum remained steady, a constant mechanical breath. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, shapes sharpening from shadow. The outline of the furnace room door grew darker, its warped frame bending the light in subtle ways. I could hear the faint ticking of cooling pipes. My own breathing. Nothing else. Then, from behind the door, the whisper began. It was softer than ever, a fragile exhale that barely touched the air. My name, drawn out in a long, wet sigh. It seemed to slip beneath the sound of the furnace, threading through the metallic groan of the pipes. The wood of the door vibrated almost imperceptibly, a faint shiver that I felt more than saw. I stayed seated, every muscle locked. The voice continued, each repetition a little clearer, a little closer, until it no longer sounded like air moving through machinery, but something with breath. Something with weight. The smell changed. A faint sweetness, like rotting fruit, seeped through the crack beneath the door. It mingled with the metallic tang, forming a scent that clung to the back of my throat. The bulb overhead flickered in a slow, irregular pattern. Each time the light dimmed, the whisper sharpened, filling the brief darkness with a clarity that left no doubt. It knew me. I don't remember standing. I only remember the cold of the doorknob beneath my palm, the rough grain of wood beneath my fingertips. The door felt alive, warm, almost pulsing against the skin. The whisper rose to meet me, my name breaking into a wet, clicking rhythm like teeth gently knocking together. I turned the handle. The door swung open with a slow, reluctant groan. Heat rolled out in a wave, heavy and damp. The furnace loomed in the center of the room, silent now, its metal skin dark and slick with condensation. The air smelled stronger, sweet rot mingling with hot iron. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, bending away from the weak light behind me. For a long, breathless moment, nothing moved. Then, from within the dark hollow of the furnace itself, something shifted. A soft scrape, like bare feet on concrete. The whisper bloomed into the room, no longer muffled by wood, no longer carried by machinery. It filled the air, wet, intimate, crawling directly against the bones of my skull. My name, over and over. The furnace door rattled once. A slow, deliberate tremor. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the threshold. The bulb overhead flared violently, flooding the room in a sickly yellow light. In that brief flash, I saw something inside the furnace. Not a shape, not fully. Just the faint impression of movement, as if the shadows themselves had drawn closer, folding inward. The light died to a dim glow. The furnace door stopped rattling. The whisper cut off mid-breath. Silence. I slammed the door and fled up the stairs, each step an eternity of echoing wood. The air of the house felt colder, thinner, as though I'd left something behind, or worse, brought something with me. I locked the basement door and pressed my back against it, heart hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. That was 3 nights ago. Since then, the whisper hasn't stopped. It no longer waits for me to descend. Now it seeps through the floorboards, rising with the heat of the furnace even when it isn't running. I hear it in the quiet hours before dawn, a soft, wet breath curling along the walls of my bedroom. My name, always my name, drawn out like a promise. Sometimes, in the thin light of morning, I catch the faint scent of rot and hot metal drifting up from below. Sometimes I feel a vibration in the floor, a low thrum that matches the rhythm of my heartbeat. The furnace remains silent, but the whisper never truly leaves. It waits, and every night it sounds closer. I never liked the basement. Even when I first bought the house, before the air turned stale and the walls began to flake, I felt something in that underground space that made my skin prickle. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you jump or run. It was slower, heavier, like a damp cloth draped over my thoughts. The stairs creaked differently when my feet touched them, and the temperature shifted with a suddenness that didn't belong to ordinary drafts. Down there, the air seemed older than the rest of the house, thick with the smell of minerals and dust, carrying a faint metallic tang, as if water had once seeped through the concrete and left behind the taste of rust. I told myself it was just an unfinished basement. Concrete walls, exposed pipes, an old furnace that hummed faintly even when it wasn't running. But sometimes late at night, I'd hear a soft, intermittent sound from below. Not loud enough to be alarming, just the kind of noise that makes you pause when you're halfway through a sentence or a sip of water. It was a scratch, a slow drag of something against stone, almost too delicate to notice unless you were listening for it. I tried to ignore it for months. It was during a rainy weekend that I finally went down to reorganize. The upstairs windows were blurred with streaks of water, and the house felt smaller with the sky pressing down. The basement smelled of wet earth, more pungent than usual, as if the rain had soaked through the soil outside and was seeping into the walls. The single bare bulb above flickered when I pulled the chain, throwing thin shadows across the floor. I moved boxes of old tools and holiday decorations, stacking them along the far wall where the concrete was mottled with darker stains. My hand brushed against a section of the wall that sounded different when I tapped it, a hollow thud instead of the dull solidity of cement. At first I thought it was just a patch of poorly cured concrete, but the sound nagged at me. I dragged a shelf aside and saw that the surface there was uneven, a faint rectangular outline hidden beneath layers of paint and dust. Curiosity outweighed caution. I fetched a crowbar from the tool rack, the metal cold and slightly greasy against my palms. Each pull against the wall sent a vibration through my arms, a grinding squeal of plaster giving way. The The smell of damp stone grew stronger as flakes of paint and powder drifted down. Behind the crumbling surface was a thin wooden panel, discolored and soft to the touch. When the panel finally gave way, a gust of air rushed out. It wasn't a strong draft, just a breath, stale, dry, and faintly sweet, like paper that had been sealed for decades. My flashlight beam fell into a narrow cavity no deeper than a few inches, lined with rough concrete. Inside, curled slightly against the wall, was a single sheet of yellowed paper. I slid it out carefully. The paper crackled beneath my fingers, brittle and dry as old leaves. It was a drawing, a child's drawing, done in heavy crayon strokes. The waxy marks were faded, but still sharp enough to make out. A crude figure stood in the center, drawn in black and brown. Its limbs were too long for the body, thin lines ending in what looked like claws instead of hands. The head was a round blotch of gray, with two hollow circles for eyes and a gaping black mouth that stretched down like a torn seam. Behind the figure was a house, my house. The outline was unmistakable, right down to the steep roof and the small basement windows. The front door was scribbled in red, with streaks that bled outward like dripping paint. In one of the tiny windows, a smaller shape peered out. A child. No face, just a silhouette. I stared at it for what felt like an hour. The basement around me seemed to grow quieter with every second, as though the furnace and the pipes had stopped breathing. The air tasted different now, sharper, carrying the faint smell of candle wax. My flashlight flickered once, a brief hiccup of light that made the shadows stretch and twitch along the floor. I turned the paper over, hoping for a name, a date, anything. The back was blank except for a small smudge of black crayon near the corner, like the start of another drawing that had been hurriedly erased. My thumb left a faint print in the fragile surface. The logical part of my mind searched for explanations. Children draw frightening things all the time. Maybe it belonged to a previous owner, hidden here by a curious child who liked secret spaces. But the longer I stared at the figure, the harder it was to cling to that comfort. The proportions were wrong, not in the way children simplify shapes, but in a way that felt intentional. As if whoever drew it wanted to capture something specific, something they had actually seen. That night I left the drawing on my workbench upstairs, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those hollow eyes staring back. The smell of the basement lingered in my nose, a mixture of damp concrete and something faintly sweet like spoiled fruit. Over the next few days, I began noticing small changes in the house. The basement door, which I always kept latched, would stand slightly ajar in the morning. A faint sound of scraping echoed from below when the rest of the house was silent. Once, while passing the top of the stairs, I caught the briefest flicker of movement in the darkness below. Not a shape, not even a shadow, just a disturbance like the air itself shifting. I tried to seal the cavity where I'd found the drawing, nailing a new wooden panel over the exposed space. The hammer strikes sounded unnaturally loud, each blow sending a vibration through the floor. But that night the noises returned, softer but more deliberate. A slow drag, like fingernails tracing along the fresh wood. I went back down with my flashlight, expecting to find nothing. The air was colder now, carrying a dampness that clung to my skin. My breath formed faint clouds in the beam of light. The new panel was still in place, but a thin line of black crayon marked the edge of the wood. A single streak, fresh and sharp, drawn with a steady hand. I don't know why I touched it. Maybe I needed to convince myself it was just a trick of the grain. But when my finger brushed the mark, a faint warmth pulsed through the wood, as if something on the other side was alive and waiting. The drawing is still upstairs on my workbench. I can't bring myself to destroy it. Some nights, when the house settles and the basement grows quiet, I imagine that long-limbed figure standing just beyond the wall, tracing the outline of my house with a crayon that never dulls. The smell of candle wax comes and goes, and with it a soft, deliberate sound, like small hands pressing against the wood, reminding me that the hidden space behind the wall was never really empty. Now, every time I descend those creaking stairs, I feel a pressure in the air, as though the basement is breathing with me. I keep the light on as long as I can, but even that thin bulb seems weaker than before, its glow swallowed by the corners. The drawing waits upstairs, but part of me knows the real image isn't on the paper anymore. It's somewhere behind that wall, watching, patient, and waiting for the next hand to peel away the boards. I never liked the basement of this house. Even before I discovered anything unusual, It carried that smell of damp concrete and old rust, thick, metallic, and faintly sour, like the breath of something that had been sleeping too long. The air down there never seemed to circulate, even when the furnace fan kicked on. It hung low and heavy, pressing against my chest in a way that made me swallow more often than I needed to. The stairs creaked as if they resented every step. Each board bowed slightly, just enough for me to feel the void beneath. Going down there felt like descending into a throat, wooden teeth overhead, cool breath rising from below. The single pull-chain bulb at the bottom always flickered, no matter how many times I replaced it. Its light was yellow and thin, barely strong enough to break apart the shadows that clung to the corners like damp cobwebs. I had moved in during early spring, when the ground was still cold enough to sweat through the walls. The water heater sat in a corner, near the far end of the basement, a dented white cylinder streaked with gray. Its pipes rattled and popped whenever the temperature changed, a sound like bones settling after a long burial. At first, I thought of it as nothing more than an old appliance. But then I began to notice something else. It started with a rhythm, soft, deliberate, and almost human. Not the hiss of steam or the gurgle of pipes, but something slower, wetter. A sound that filled the silence between the heater's clicks and the faint hum of the furnace. It reminded me of a sleeping animal. A drawn-in breath, a pause, and then a long exhale that seemed to shiver through the concrete floor. The first time I heard it, I froze halfway across the basement, laundry basket balanced on my hip. I told myself it was the heater cycling or the house settling. But the sound didn't match the mechanical noises I knew. It was too uneven, too alive. I stood there until the hairs on my arms prickled and the laundry felt heavy against my side. Then I backed up the stairs, one step at a time, careful not to let the basket shift and make a sound. Over the next week, it returned. Always when the house was quiet. Late at night, when I crept down to switch laundry or check the breaker. Early in the morning, when the sky above the tiny basement windows was still black. Each time, I'd hear that soft, patient breathing. Slow inhalations, as though something hidden behind the heater was savoring the damp air of its hiding place. The space behind the water heater was narrow, a wedge of darkness between the tank and the concrete wall. No more than a foot wide, choked with pipes and old insulation. Nothing could possibly fit back there. Yet when I stood at the edge and listened, the sound seemed to swell upward from that very spot, rising through the gap like warm breath escaping a throat. I started leaving the laundry to pile upstairs. I told myself it was laziness, but really it was avoidance. Even so, the sound followed me in small ways. At night, lying in bed, I thought I could feel the rhythm beneath the floor. Slow and steady, like something breathing deep in the bones of the house. Sometimes I woke with the taste of rust on my tongue, as if the damp air had found its way into my dreams. One evening, after a day of steady rain, the smell grew stronger. It rolled up from the basement like a tide of wet stone and cold iron. I found myself standing at the top of the stairs before I even realized I'd moved. The light was already on, swaying faintly though there was no draft. The air rising from below felt warmer than usual, moist enough to cling to my skin. Each step down gave a little more of the basement back to my senses. The faint hum of the furnace, the drip of water along the far wall, and beneath it all, that breathing. Louder now, more deliberate, like someone standing close enough for me to feel the subtle push of air against my face. I reached the bottom and turned toward the heater. The bulb's light bent around it, leaving the space behind drowned in shadow. I stood perfectly still. The breathing slowed as if matching my own. When I inhaled, it inhaled. When I held my breath, it paused. A quiet, wet patience filled the room. A thin ribbon of condensation slid down the side of the tank and disappeared into the darkness behind it. I leaned slightly, just enough to see the edge of the gap. Nothing moved. The smell was strongest there, wet metal and something faintly sweet, like fruit left to rot in a sealed jar. My mouth watered against my will. I wanted to step closer, to look behind the heater, but the floor felt wrong beneath me. The concrete seemed softer, almost spongy, as though something beneath had been hollowed out. The breathing deepened, a slow pull that drew the damp air inward. My ears popped, the way they do in an elevator when the pressure shifts. The pull-chain bulb flickered and went dark. The basement sank into a gray half-light, lit only by the thin rain-washed glow from the windows. I couldn't hear the furnace anymore, only that breath. Closer now, wet and deep, like the lungs of something far larger than any person. It filled the space behind the heater and pressed against my chest, making every inhale feel stolen. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds stretched until they felt like minutes. The smell thickened until it coated my teeth. My vision swam with the faint outline of the heater's curve, the shadow behind it pulsing with the rhythm of the sound. My legs trembled. Some part of me waited for a shape to emerge, a hand, a face, anything to match the breath that filled the room. But nothing came. Only the slow exhale, and then silence. When the light flickered back on, the heater looked exactly the same. The concrete floor was dry beneath my feet. No sign of anything disturbed. I backed away without turning my back, my heartbeat rushing louder than the silence around me. The stairs groaned as I climbed, each creak sounding like a warning. That night, I locked the basement door for the first time. But the sound didn't stay below. I heard it in the walls as I lay in bed, the faint rise and fall of a hidden lung. I imagined the narrow gap behind the heater, damp and waiting. I imagined something pressing its mouth against the concrete, breathing deep from the stale air of the house. Days passed. I avoided the basement entirely. Dirty laundry piled high, fuses went unchecked, but I couldn't force myself down those stairs. Yet the breathing remained, a low echo beneath every sound. Sometimes I'd catch it in the pipes when the house was otherwise silent. Sometimes, in the thin hours before dawn, I'd feel it brush the underside of the floor, as if something was moving closer, finding new pockets of air to claim. I don't know what waits behind that water heater. Maybe it's nothing more than damp air and the restless memory of an old house. But every time I close my eyes, I see the shadow pulsing in time with my own breath. And I wonder how long it has been there listening, how long before it stops breathing in time with me and starts to breathe on its own. The flood came in the middle of a night that smelled of iron and rain. I remember lying awake as the storm pressed itself against the house, the wind dragging branches across the siding like fingernails over skin. Water hammered the gutters until they overflowed, spilling down the windows in silver curtains. Somewhere beneath the floor, I heard the crawl space filling, a hollow sloshing sound that rose and fell with each gust of wind. The old house shuddered around me like a body trying to breathe through water. By morning, the air was swollen with the damp sweetness of rotting leaves. I stepped into a world that felt rearranged. The basement door groaned under a swollen frame, the wood damp and gritty to the touch. When I finally forced it open, a heavy breath of earth and mildew rolled up the stairs, thick enough to taste. The floodwater had receded, but it had left a film of black silt across the floor, a slick sheen that caught the weak light leaking through the high windows. The basement had always been unsettling, low ceiling, uneven concrete, a smell that never changed no matter how many times I scrubbed. That morning it felt different, as though the storm had peeled something back. The air had a sharp mineral edge, wet stone mixed with something older, almost animal. My boots sank slightly into the mud-slick floor as I waded toward the far wall, where the water had pooled deepest. That was when I noticed it, a line in the wall that had never been there before. The basement walls were poured concrete, painted a dull beige years ago, but along the far corner a thin vertical seam had emerged, faint but undeniable. The flood had washed away a strip of paint, revealing a crack as straight as a cut from a blade. The edges were too clean to be a flaw. I ran my fingers along it and felt an almost imperceptible draft whispering through, cool and dry despite the wet room. I pressed harder, and the seam gave a soft, hollow sound. A section of wall flexed beneath my palm, not like concrete, but like something lighter hidden behind a coat of plaster. The realization came slowly, a chill moving from my chest to my fingertips. There was space back there. The storm had loosened something the house had kept secret. I fetched a crowbar from the tool shelf, its metal cold and slick with condensation. Each strike sent echoes up through the floorboards, a deep ringing that made the ceiling pipes tremble. Chunks of plaster broke away in damp flakes, revealing wood beneath. The boards were nailed crudely, their grains swollen from years of hidden moisture. With a final wrench, one of them tore free, and a breath of stale air exhaled from the darkness beyond. The smell was the first thing to reach me, dry dust laced with something faintly sweet, like dried flowers crushed into soil. I shone my flashlight through the gap. Behind the wall was a narrow doorway, no more than a shoulder's width, descending into a darkness that seemed to absorb the light. The beam faded after a few feet, swallowed by a shadow too dense to be explained by mere absence of light. Water dripped somewhere inside, a soft, deliberate sound that echoed as though falling into a vast, empty chamber. I crawled through the gap, my shoulders scraping against splintered wood. The air inside was colder, the kind of cold that doesn't just chill but presses into bone. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand, its beam crawling across rough stone walls lined with wooden beams darkened to near black. The floor was packed earth, uneven and damp, the mud still holding the memory of the flood that had uncovered it. The passage curved downward like a throat. My boots sank with each step, the mud giving a soft suction that seemed to resist movement. The smell intensified, a mixture of old soil, wet iron, and something faintly organic, like hair left to rot. The sound of dripping water followed me, steady and patient. After what felt longer than it could have been, the corridor opened into a room. My light revealed a chamber roughly square, the ceiling low enough that I had to hunch. The walls were lined with shelves carved directly into the stone, each holding objects sealed beneath layers of dust. Jars with cloudy glass, bundles of something wrapped in yellowing cloth, a small wooden chest whose lid sagged but remained shut. In the center of the room stood a single chair. It was wooden, the kind of simple, straight-backed chair you'd expect in a kitchen from a century ago. A faint trail of silt led to its legs, as if water had lapped at it recently. On the seat lay a book, its cover warped with moisture but still intact. I stepped closer, my breath loud in the stale air. The floor beneath the chair was different, harder, with a hollow resonance that echoed my weight. The earth here had been tamped with unnatural precision. I reached for the book. The leather was slick, like skin left in cold water. When I lifted it, a faint sigh escaped from beneath the chair, the sound of air being drawn into hidden space. My light caught on something carved into the wood of the seat. Symbols, sharp and looping, their edges still dark as though freshly cut despite the dust. The pages inside were brittle, covered in handwriting that slanted like crawling insects. I couldn't read the words, though they looked almost familiar, fragments of letters that refused to arrange themselves into meaning. A faint smell rose from the paper, dried herbs, iron, and something sweetly rancid. The room seemed to lean closer as I turned the pages. The dripping water slowed until each drop landed with a sound too heavy for its size. My ears filled with a low hum, as though the stone itself were vibrating. The flashlight flickered, throwing jagged shadows that seemed to shift even when the beam steadied. I don't remember how long I stood there. At some point I became aware of a sound beneath the hum, a wet rustling like something moving through soil. It came from below the chair, faint but growing clearer, the slow, deliberate scrape of something rising through earth. The hollow spot beneath the chair seemed to pulse, the packed dirt lifting by imperceptible degrees. My own heartbeat drowned the sound for a moment, but the rustling continued, patient and steady. A sudden drop of water landed on my neck, icy and sharp. I jerked upward, the flashlight swinging wildly. The ceiling above was dry. Another drop struck my hand, then another. But there was no water. The air thickened, carrying a scent like wet metal and old breath. My flashlight dimmed to a thin, dying glow. In the failing light, I thought I saw the earth beneath the chair shift again, the packed dirt cracking in a slow, deliberate circle. Something inside the crack glimmered, not wet but slick, as if a surface of flesh were straining toward open air. The light went out. I don't remember leaving the room. My next memory is of the basement floor against my palms, my knees sinking into the flood-soaked silt. The hole in the wall gaped behind me, a black rectangle seeping a cold draft that smelled of soil and something faintly sweet. My flashlight lay beside me, dead though the batteries were new. I sealed the wall the next day, layering wood and concrete until the seam disappeared beneath fresh paint. Yet some nights, when rain swells the air and the ground beneath the house softens, I hear it again. The faint sound of dripping water where there should be none. The slow, deliberate scrape of something moving upward through the earth. The breath of a room that should not exist, waiting behind the wall I buried alive. And always, beneath it all, the soft rustle of pages turning in the dark. I first noticed it on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of morning that usually feels harmless. Soft daylight pooling through the curtains, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the kitchen. My house had always been unremarkable, a two-story structure built in the late 1950s, with creaky wooden floors and a draft that whispered through the cracks in the old windows. It wasn't the kind of place that made you feel uneasy, at least not at first. But that morning, when I walked into the hallway that connected the kitchen to the living room, I saw something that made me stop mid-step. A stain, dark, irregular, and disturbingly organic. It was near the baseboard, where the hardwood floor met the pale wall. At first, I thought it might have been a spill, maybe wine, maybe coffee, but the color was wrong. Too deep, too dense. A dark maroon that had seeped into the grain of the wood, almost black in some places. The edges feathered outward in tiny, finger-like rivulets, as though it had once been liquid, soaking into the planks beneath. My first instinct was to clean it. I fetched a rag, some warm water, and a bottle of heavy-duty cleaner from beneath the sink. The smell of chemicals filled the hallway as I knelt down, pressing the rag against the stain. It resisted. The more I scrubbed, the more it seemed to push back, clinging to the wood like something alive. After 10 minutes of hard scrubbing, my knuckles sore and my hands trembling from the effort, the stain finally lightened to a dull reddish smear. I should have left it at that. That night, as I lay in bed, a faint smell woke me. Metallic, sharp, and unmistakable. The scent of blood. I followed it downstairs, half asleep, my feet brushing against the cold wooden steps. When I reached the hallway, my heart began to hammer. The stain was back, darker than before, perfectly shaped as though I had never touched it. The next morning, I attacked it with bleach. The pungent fumes burned my nose and eyes as I poured it directly onto the wood, scrubbing until my hands stung. The bleach lifted some of the color, but the smell remained, an undercurrent of rust and earth that no amount of cleaning could mask. When I stood back to examine my work, the floor looked clean. For the first time that day, I felt a flicker of relief. But that night, it returned again. The stain wasn't just reappearing, it was growing. At first, it spread only an inch or two, a faint bloom around the edges. But by the third night, it had doubled in size, its edges jagged and wet-looking, as if something beneath the floorboards was pressing upward, bleeding through the seams. The air in the hallway grew heavy, thick with a dampness that made my skin crawl. The smell was stronger now, not just metallic but sweet, like rotting fruit left too long in the sun. I pulled up the floorboards. The wood groaned as I pried it loose, splinters catching on my palms. Beneath, I expected to find damp insulation or maybe a leaking pipe. Instead, I found darkness. The subfloor was dry, perfectly intact, no sign of moisture or decay. Yet the stain continued to seep upward, oozing through the seams like something pushing to escape. Sleep became impossible. Every night, the smell invaded my dreams, thick and suffocating. I began to hear faint sounds, a soft dripping, irregular and hollow, as if liquid were falling onto an unseen surface deep below. Sometimes it was followed by a faint scratching, delicate and deliberate, like nails grazing wood. I bought stronger cleaners, industrial-grade solvents. Nothing worked. The stain returned each night, larger, darker, almost pulsing when I shined a flashlight across its surface. I pressed my ear to the floor once, desperate to understand what I was dealing with. Beneath the wood, something moved. It was not the skittering of mice or the hum of pipes. It was slow, rhythmic, wet. The house began to change around it. Paint peeled and thin, curling sheets along the hallway walls, revealing older layers of wallpaper underneath. Patterns of faded roses and intricate vines that I had never seen before. The air grew colder in that part of the house, the draft sharpening until I could see my breath. One evening, while scrubbing until my hands bled, I noticed something else. Tiny shapes embedded in the stain. Not just random patterns, but something deliberate. Lines intersecting, curves forming crude symbols. They seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, twisting into new arrangements like a message I wasn't meant to read. I stopped cleaning after that, but the stain did not stop. It spread beyond the hallway, curling into the living room, creeping along the baseboards and across the floor like a slow-moving shadow. Each morning I woke to find more of the house consumed. The smell became unbearable, iron and salt, like an open wound. My clothes absorbed it. My skin carried it. No matter how often I showered, the scent followed me. Neighbors began to notice. A delivery driver commented on the strange coppery smell seeping from beneath the door. A friend who visited for the first and last time refused to step inside, her face pale, her eyes darting to the hallway as though she sensed something watching her. I called professionals, cleaners, contractors, even a plumber. None of them could explain it. Some refused to work after their first visit, claiming headaches, nausea, or a sudden sense of dread. One man, an older contractor with a grizzled face, stood silently for a long time before muttering that the house wasn't right and leaving without another word. Weeks passed. I no longer slept. The stain reached the stairs, inching upward, its dark fingers creeping onto the first step. At night, the sounds grew louder, the dripping now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to rise from beneath the floor. Sometimes I thought I heard my name. I tried leaving, packed a bag, locked the door, and drove to a motel across town. But the smell followed me. It clung to my clothes, my hair, even the inside of my car. I woke in the motel room to find a small dark smear on the carpet near the bed. A perfect circle, deep maroon, soaking into the fibers. I returned to the house the next day. I don't know why. The stain covered nearly the entire first floor now. A dark, slick surface that reflected no light. Walking across it felt wrong. The wood beneath soft, almost spongy, as though I were stepping on flesh. The air hummed with a low vibration, a sound felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. I don't clean anymore. There's no point. The stain breathes now, rising and falling almost imperceptibly, as though the house itself is alive. Sometimes, when I stand in the hallway late at night, I can hear it, a slow, wet heartbeat echoing beneath my feet. I've stopped fighting. Every attempt to erase, it only made it stronger, angrier. Now I wait, breathing in the metallic air, watching as the dark surface inches closer to the walls, the stairs, the ceiling. I wonder how long it will take before it consumes everything, before it reaches the room where I sleep. Sometimes I press my hand against the floor, feeling the faint warmth beneath the stain. It feels like skin. It feels like something waiting to be born. I used to believe that I knew every sound this house could make. The creak of the third stair when you put your weight on the left side. The faint groan of the rafters when the temperature dropped at night. Even the soft rush of air when the furnace kicked on in the middle of winter. Those noises became a kind of language to me, a familiar background hum that meant everything was normal. But I was wrong. For months, maybe longer, another sound was hiding beneath those ordinary creaks, a subtle rhythm that didn't belong. I only noticed it once the silence of late autumn began to settle over the house, when the trees outside lost their leaves and the wind stopped carrying the chatter of insects. That's when I first heard it, a faint, uneven scraping from somewhere deep below my feet. Our basement had always unnerved me. It wasn't finished, just poured concrete walls lined with sweating pipes and stacks of forgotten boxes. The air down there carried a mineral dampness, a smell like wet iron and cold soil that clung to your clothes. Even with the light on, the corners never seemed fully lit. The single bulb cast a yellow cone that left the edges in a permanent twilight. I rarely stayed there longer than I had to. Laundry in, laundry out. Done. The scraping began as a whisper, soft enough that I blamed the furnace. It came late at night, when the house settled into its deeper quiet. I would be upstairs reading, and there it was again, a dry slide of something against concrete. It didn't match the mechanical thrum of the heater. It wasn't the pipes. It was deliberate. A pause. Another faint drag, as though something heavy was shifting across the floor at a careful pace. I tried to ignore it. For weeks I convinced myself it was the house aging, a rodent maybe, or water moving through the old drain. But the sound grew bolder. Sometimes it came while the furnace was already running, layered beneath the metallic whine of the motor like a hidden heartbeat. It had weight to it, a slow pressure that made the wooden joists in the floor feel alive beneath my feet. Then came the smell. It arrived one morning as I descended for laundry, a sharp sourness buried beneath the usual damp. Not rot, not mildew, something almost human. The air tasted stale, like skin left unwashed. I stood at the bottom of the stairs holding the basket, feeling the cold of the concrete radiate through my shoes. The bulb flickered once, then steadied. Nothing moved, but the odor thickened the longer I stayed, crawling into my throat until I fled back upstairs with the load half finished. Days passed. The scraping continued. At night I felt the vibrations through the mattress, subtle but certain, as though someone far below was shifting their weight against the earth. My mind began to draw shapes in the darkness, images of cracks in the foundation, of tunnels hidden behind the walls. I pictured something blind and pale crawling through the old coal chute we'd sealed decades ago. Each thought tightened my chest until sleep became a thin, restless thing. One evening, driven by a mixture of dread and stubborn curiosity, I finally went down to inspect every inch. The air struck colder than usual, carrying that same faint human musk. I moved slowly, letting the single bulb swing on its cord. Its light traced arcs across the clutter, rusted shelving, stacked boxes of holiday decorations, a broken dryer we never threw out. Dust drifted in the glow like ash. I crouched to peer beneath the workbench, behind the furnace, along the foundation cracks. Nothing. Only the steady drip of water from a pipe and the low electric hum of the bulb. Yet something felt wrong. The floor near the far wall looked different, darker concrete, slightly damp. When I pressed my palm against it, the surface felt warmer than the surrounding floor, as though something beneath was radiating heat. I leaned closer, and that was when I noticed the faint seam running along the base of the wall. A thin line of dustless concrete, a hair's width gap that traced the outline of what might once have been a service door. My heart pounded with a deep, sick rhythm. I fetched a screwdriver from the workbench and scraped along the seam. Flakes of old paint gave way to raw cement. The smell intensified, stale sweat, unwashed cloth, something sour like spoiled milk. I pulled harder until a small wedge of the wall shifted inward with a muffled pop. A hidden panel. Behind it, a pocket of darkness exhaled a gust of air that felt impossibly warm against my face. I aimed my flashlight inside. The beam cut across a narrow chamber, no larger than a crawl space. The floor was littered with crumpled blankets, food wrappers, and the gleam of aluminum cans. A dented camping stove rested beside a bucket. On the far side, scrawled across the concrete in black marker, was a single smeared word, "Stay." For a long moment I couldn't breathe. The reality of it pressed in with unbearable clarity. Someone had been living here. Not long ago, the blankets were still damp with body heat, the food wrappers recent. I stepped back, flashlight trembling in my grip. Every creak of the house above suddenly belonged to an intruder's memory. Had I walked over their sleeping body night after night? How long had they listened to my footsteps, breathing quietly as I carried laundry just inches away? A soft rustle came from the far end of the chamber. Not imagined, real. The blankets shifted ever so slightly, the faintest suggestion of movement beneath them. My light caught the curve of something pale withdrawing into shadow. A hand, thin and colorless, retreating like a wounded animal. I stumbled backward, heart hammering so violently I thought it would burst. The panel scraped against the floor as I shoved it closed, sealing the warmth and stench inside. I raced up the stairs 2 at a time, the bulb swinging wildly behind me. Every instinct screamed to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that hidden pocket of darkness. I called the authorities from the safety of my locked bedroom. When they arrived, their flashlights cut through the basement gloom with clinical brightness. They pried open the panel and flooded the chamber with light. It was empty. Only the blankets, the wrappers, the bucket. No footprints beyond my own. The officers exchanged tired glances, muttered something about trespassers and vagrants, and filed a report. They told me to install better locks, then left me standing in the hollow echo of my own house. That night, I barely slept. The image of that pale hand replayed behind my eyelids, the smell of stale sweat lingering in my nostrils no matter how many times I washed. I kept expecting to hear the scraping again, but the basement remained unnervingly silent, as though holding its breath. Days later, the silence broke. It was subtle at first, a faint rhythmic creak, softer than before, coming not from below but from somewhere within the walls themselves. A slow, careful shifting of weight, like someone learning the soundscape of a new hiding place. The air carried a familiar warmth, rising through the vents, carrying with it the unmistakable trace of human presence. Now I live with that knowledge every day. I still hear the house at night, but I no longer mistake its language for comfort. Every creak might be a step. Every draft might be a breath. The man who lived in our basement is gone, or perhaps he never left at all. Maybe he simply found another pocket of darkness, a place deeper than I can reach, where he can listen to me moving through my own home, waiting for the moment when the sound of scraping begins again. I bought the mirror because it felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with weight. It leaned against the back wall of a small antique store, half buried behind stacks of crooked picture frames and chipped porcelain dolls. The glass was dark, tinted with the subtle yellow of age, and the wood of its frame carried a blackness that seemed deeper than any paint. At first glance it looked like something pulled from a decaying Victorian house. Ornate carvings of twisting vines and flowers, each petal chipped but still somehow sharp. Dust filmed its surface in a soft gray skin, yet even through the dirt, the reflection had a depth that made the air around it feel colder. The shop smelled of old varnish and rusted metal, that dry sweetness of forgotten wood. I remember running a fingertip across the mirror's edge and feeling a faint vibration, as if a faint hum pulsed through the glass. The sensation made the tiny hairs on my arm rise, but there was a strange pull that made me want it more. I told myself it was just a piece of furniture, just an object that would look beautiful against the blank wall of my bedroom. I convinced myself of that even as the air around it felt a few degrees colder, even as my own reflection seemed to lag just a breath behind when I tilted my head. It took 2 men to carry it to my car, and even then the frame creaked in protest, wood grinding faintly like teeth. Driving home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something shifting in the back seat. The antique mirror lay wrapped in an old blanket, but I could swear the glass underneath caught flashes of passing headlights, tiny movements that flickered in places where no light should have reached. When I finally set it against the wall of my room, the entire atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy and damp, like the first few minutes before a thunderstorm. My room had always smelled faintly of laundry detergent and the cedar of my dresser, but now there was a faint, metallic scent, like old coins left in a wet palm. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the smell of old wood and dust shaking free after years of storage. That night I could not stop staring at it. Even in the dark, the mirror seemed to hold a dull glow, as if it remembered light long after the lamp had been switched off. The surface didn't simply reflect, it absorbed. The shadows in my room stretched toward it, bending slightly as if the glass was pulling them closer. When I moved, my reflection followed, but always with the faintest delay. Half a heartbeat slower, like a puppet responding to a hidden string. Days passed, and I began to notice subtle changes. The first was in my own face. At certain angles, the skin under my eyes seemed a little darker, the mouth slightly sharper, as though I were looking at a version of myself that had aged overnight. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of an expression I hadn't made, a small twitch at the corner of the mouth, a narrowing of the eyes. Once, I leaned in close and saw the faintest curl of a smile, though my own lips were pressed tight. The smell grew stronger, no longer just metallic but damp, like wet stone and rotting leaves. I opened windows, scrubbed the frame, even burned candles, but the odor clung stubbornly to the air around the mirror. At night, when the house settled into silence, a soft sound began to emerge from the glass. Not a hum anymore, but a low, wet breathing. A rhythm, patient and slow. It was the kind of sound you might hear with your ear pressed against the chest of a sleeping animal. Steady, but not entirely human. I started avoiding the room, yet the mirror never let me forget it was there. Every time I walked past the door, I felt a tug at the edge of my thoughts, a gentle pressure behind the eyes, as though something inside the glass was aware of me and wanted me closer. When I finally gave in and stepped inside, the air felt heavier, thick enough that breathing took effort. Dust motes floated lazily but never seemed to settle, as if caught in a current I could not feel. One evening, just after sunset, I caught it. I had turned quickly, expecting to see my own reflection staring back, but instead the face staring out of the glass was not mine. It was similar, so disturbingly similar it took a moment for my brain to understand what was wrong. The eyes were wider, too round, the skin a shade too pale, the mouth hanging slightly open as if caught mid-breath. The figure stood exactly where I stood, matching every tilt of my head, but the timing was wrong, the movements just a fraction too slow. My stomach knotted as I stepped closer. The figure mirrored me, but in the faint light its features began to shift, as though the surface of the glass were water disturbed by a stone. The skin seemed to ripple, bones beneath pressing against the surface like something trying to push through. A faint crack appeared in the corner of the mirror, not on the outside but within the glass itself, spreading like a spiderweb across the reflection's cheek. I stumbled back and the image snapped to normal, my own tired face staring back, eyes wide with fear. But the crack remained, a thin white vein that hadn't been there before. Sleep became impossible after that. I would wake to the sound of soft tapping from the direction of the mirror, like fingernails against glass. The air around it felt damp and icy, a chill that seeped into the floorboards. Sometimes I would find faint smears on the inside of the glass, pale streaks that looked like fingerprints pressed from the other side. My own reflection began to look less like me with each passing night. Cheekbones sharper, eyes darker, as though the figure behind the glass was slowly carving itself free of my image. The worst came 3 nights ago. I woke to a noise so faint it barely rose above the sound of my own breathing. A wet scraping, like fabric dragging across stone. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw movement inside the mirror. Not my reflection, but a shadow, rising slowly from the bottom edge of the frame. The face that emerged was the one I had glimpsed before, only clearer now, its features stretched into something hungry. The eyes were fixed on me with a terrible patience, lips parting to reveal a mouth too wide, teeth too many. It leaned forward until its forehead pressed against the glass, and I swear I heard it breathe. The sound carried through the room, a soft, damp exhale that fogged the inside of the mirror. I watched in frozen horror as a single pale hand emerged from the darkness behind it, fingers splayed against the inner surface. The nails dragged slowly downward, leaving faint trails of condensation that faded almost immediately. I could not move. My body felt nailed to the floor as the figure began to mimic my breathing, inhaling when I inhaled, exhaling just a fraction behind me, like a cruel echo. Its lips began to move, forming words I could not hear, though the room around me vibrated with a low, humming resonance. The crack in the glass spread wider, a jagged smile inching across the surface. A sudden pop rang out, sharp as a gunshot, and the sound broke whatever trance held me. I ran from the room, slamming the door behind me, heart hammering so violently it felt like it would tear free from my chest. I slept on the couch, too afraid to even glance toward the hallway. Morning light brought no comfort. When I finally gathered the courage to re-enter the room, the mirror stood silent and intact. The crack was gone. My reflection was ordinary again, though the air still smelled faintly of wet stone and metal. I considered calling someone to remove it, but the thought of anyone else seeing what I saw fills me with a deeper dread. Some things feel too dangerous to share. Now I live with the mirror, as one might live with a dormant predator. I keep the curtains drawn, avoid its gaze, and never linger too close. Yet sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I feel its attention pressing against the back of my mind. When I close my eyes, I sense a shape moving inside the glass, patient and deliberate, waiting for the thin layer of reality to wear just a little thinner. I know it is only a matter of time before the reflection I see is no longer mine.